All right, so where I left off is we were going to go into South Africa and apartheid. Before I go into this, I just want to go back and revisit the topic that I kind of addressed. Was that in North Africa, um, it's dominated by Arab culture, and some people believe that many of the Arabs of North Africa are actually Arabized Berbers or other indigenous peoples that over time took on Arab identity, such as in Egypt. I mean, the Christian community in Egypt, the Coptic Church uses Coptic in their liturgy for which is actually ancient. It's related to ancient Egyptian, um, but they still speak Arabic, and most Christian Arabs in Egypt would be identified as Arabs. So the question is, are they actual Egyptians that were then Arabized, or did Arab colonization drown out the local population? Um, and I haven't actually researched this enough to have a really definitive answer, just to point that out and say that for North Africa, it's often viewed as its own kind of more connected to the Middle East than sub-Saharan Africa, and that there does exist to be racism within the North against Black Africans. Gaddafi of Libya, for all of his craziness and bad ways, fought very hard against Arab-centric practices and racism against Black Africans. So that's been an issue up there. Now, what happens in the South here in South Africa is a more overt form of racism, a very direct, institutionalized, in-your-face kind of national racism that took place. And I grew up at the time when this was actually a big deal on the news a lot. And I'm not sure how many here are aware of it. I should have talked about this more before when we saw the video on Israel-Palestine, and I gave a video clip on apartheid in Israel, the question of whether or not Israel is becoming an apartheid state. And there were Black South Africans doing comparisons between what they experienced in apartheid South Africa, and then there was Palestinians trying to kind of tell their story to being in Israel now and in occupied territories. And so it did kind of help for you to have a little background knowledge already of what apartheid was in South Africa. So South Africa was an autonomous British dominion until 1961. And there was these Dutch settlers that eventually also would fight off the British to become an independent state. There was what was called the Boer Wars, and I think I might have discussed this a little bit before. I can't remember. Unfortunately, we don't have time for it. But needless to say, these Dutch settlers were Protestant Christian Scandinavians who really saw themselves as like God's chosen people, and taking that biblical notion about does God give a promised land to Jews in Palestine / Israel? They somewhat took on this idea of they were the chosen people of God, and that this land was for them, and it was full of infidels, meaning the Black people. And the South Afrikaner culture developed its own unique ways. So their language is called Afrikaans, they're called Afrikaners, but their language is very similar to Dutch, and you can see some of the wordings here, and mixed strong with English. In any case, Daniel Malan's National Party became to power in 1948, creating a strictly segregated system. So this apartheid is an Afrikaner word meaning apartness. So we talked about segregation in the deep south of America. This is a much more extreme version of it. Interracial marriages were forbidden, and they had a racial hierarchy. There was white South Afrikaners, and there was coloreds, and then there was blacks. Okay? And obviously for Black South Africans, this was a humiliating place to be, and so there was resistance formed against it. And the ANC became one of the major components of that African National Congress. It was outlawed with in South Africa with the South African Communist Party, and the communists did do a lot of work with the ANC. If you see here, Nelson Mandela, who later was going to become the first black president of South Africa after the end of apartheid. Again, who's he with? Fidel. Now, when Nelson Mandela became the first black president, African president, after the end of apartheid, he was far from socialist, and many criticized the fact that he did certain policies that ultimately left the white Afrikaners still in the advantage. But if you look at the way like apartheid ended, which again we don't have like time to go over, the Afrikaner elite class made sure that they could keep their wealth intact, even if their political superiority was going to be somewhat sidelined. So the wealth disparity in South Africa is still great between white South Afrikaners and black South Afrikaners. And again, if at the time, the white South Afrikaners always accused black Africans of basically being communists, and communists were often helping black Africans in resistance to such things, and so there's this kind of amicable relations there. And again, I go back to, I've revisited this over and over, unlikely supporters of apartheid. We see leaders from Israel working with apartheid, South Africa, and then there's Margaret Thatcher again. Oh, I just love her. She just seems to warm up to all the great characters of the modern times. In fact, Israel and the United States were essentially supporters of apartheid South Africa because it was a buffer against African nationalism and communism. And that's somewhat of a controversial legacy as well. Apartheid does end up ending, and again, this whole idea of Cold War politics was intertwined with it. That was a all too brief coverage of a lot of different topics about Africa. But again, I hope I'm giving you kind of like some sort of titillating exposure to certain things that you might say, gosh, I want to explore this more. What's going on here? You might find one of these particular aspects more interesting to study in the future. And of course, for your last essay for this week, you can pick one of those topics. I'm kind of babbling, and I'm just going to end it right here.